Welcome to panel E, James, the Politics and Literature of Cricket. We have three speakers this morning, so I'm going to keep introductions to a minimum. The speakers have each promised that they're going to stick strictly to 20 minutes, which will give us plenty of time for questions at the end. So I think, without further ado, we'll make a start with the first talk, C.L.R. James, W.G. Grace, and Mediating the Claim of the Representative Figure, from Neil Washbourne, Leeds Metropolitan University.
Yes, thank you very much then, Chris. You'll see it's a slightly different title on the paper I'm actually giving. What am I trying to do in this paper? First, focus on the centrality of representation and the representative figure, not just W.G. Grace, but as a structure of understanding within Beyond the Boundary. And as far as I know, it's not really been considered and talked about in the secondary literature. Secondly, to look at W.G. Grace as a crucial figure in James's own biography as a young boy reading about him and in that model within Beyond the Boundary. Thirdly, to reinvestigate Grace a little bit because, in a sense, James doesn't get him completely wrong. He's too good a scholar and a thinker for that. But in significant ways, we can look at the Grace figure again and think about the meanings associated with his actions, especially in 1895. I'm going to consider the mediation of these representative figures, especially W.G. Grace, because that, in terms of media coverage of those figures, because that C.L.R. James doesn't really consider at all, and yet it's crucial to, in a sense, intermediary institutions, newspapers and other bodies who try to make the figure mean something of use to them. So that's what I'll try to do as well. And since I work especially in media studies, I hope I've got some special expertise to bring to that, because I have no special expertise in James's work, although I've read a lot of it again in the past 4 months. I was very pleased to see in Dr. McCree's paper yesterday that some of the suggested titles articulated the notion that W.G. Grace was central to this book. W.G., a West Indian Grace, West Indian Progeny of Grace seem to be very interesting titles where when C.L.R. was required to think again about a title, he came back to the Grace figure. Some of the analysis that I give here around representation, both political representation and symbolic and other kinds of representation, can also be found in my book Mediating Politics, published by Open University Press in 2010. The page references I'm going to give are to the Serpent's Tail edition, the one just second right there. So if I sort of occasionally mumble some pages, that's the book that I'm referring to. Okay, so I'm going to give you a diagram first of all. This is my model of what the mediated representative claim is. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes sort of talking about it in some kind of detail. What are those mediated figures? Page 66, selected individuals who have representative roles and those roles are charged with social significance. That's the model that we're talking about. What is the representation? Sometimes it's representation of the nation, sometimes it's representation of people, sometimes it's representation of spirit of the age in Beyond the Boundary. Some other writers have considered cricket as an art form to be the central structure, and I'm not suggesting that representation is more important, but it's, in a sense, equally important as cricket as an art form. And if we think about cricket as an art form, we have to think about the account that James gives of the cut stroke with its history going from Silver Billy Beldam in the 18th century to Arthur Jones, page 6, George Cox, Frank Worrell, Headley and Woolley, page 143, and Wilton St Hill, pages 83 and 84. But what I want to focus on is not cricket as an art form. Central as it is linking clubs and spectators and their knowledge of the embodied knowledge of the game. The creation of specialist clubs which are then selected, representative clubs, where you represent an island and eventually you represent the West Indies too. And that's what I want to get at. Let's take a figure who didn't play a representative role even though he was a great cricketer, and we start to get at the complexity of C.L.R. James's account. George John, who he considers one of the great fast bowlers, but is not a hero, was not received with enthusiasm and excitement as a more general figure, page 80. How does C.L.R. James explain this? He had, George John, no sense of injustice, no sense of a desire that he had to prove or wanted to prove himself. So somehow, however great you are as a cricketer, you often need other kind of requirements to play the role, the function of the representative figure. The Shannon Club played that role, and if we look at his account of the Shannon Club and the cricketers who played for it, 6 Shannon bowlers in the 1929 Trinidad 11, page 55, and then he defines it in terms of Shannonism, a kind of ideology, formation that the club seemed to embody. Spirit, fire, spontaneous self-discipline and cohesion, page 57. If we think about the transition from cricketers who played for the islands and eventually played for West Indies, we come across the first real mention of tragedy when thinking about Wilton St Hill, who C.L.R. James loves as a figure of cricket, but says he wasn't chosen for the 1923 tour of England. He was chosen for the 1928 tour, but the subterranean aspirations of West Indies cricket met and crashed in him because he didn't play well on that 1928 tour. He didn't fulfill those requirements, whereas Leary Constantine did, and subsequently. And then there's the litany of great West Indian cricketers who met and constituted a West Indian identity and the idea of a positive engagement with the game and taking the game even further stages, making it not so much an English or British game, but taking it and making it a West Indian game. Leary Constantine, George Headley, Frank Worrell, and then Sobers, who is the apotheosis of this and is, the evidence of the public entry into the Comity of Nations, page 261. So this is the model of representation. You can see I've got representation going on all the way around, and representation, as far as I know, hasn't really been written about, so I wanted to make that hugely important. So what about Grace as a representative figure himself, and as a model then for James thinking about that West Indian cricketers could play this representative role and in a sense gather together the political community, in a way represent what he always wants to see as somehow something like an organic community. So he's a representative figure of, according to James, of pre-Victorian England. You can see that in the handout I've given you, where he identifies W.G. Grace with Alfred Myn, who was a yeoman farmer earlier in the 19th century. But this is a mythology as well. This doesn't mean it's completely untrue. It means it's a kind of reinvention and invented tradition, using Hobsbawm's notion. And so we have to think about the complex reinventing that goes on in making somebody a representative figure. But it's not just about W.G. Grace, it is him as the model that James uses from his very early childhood of reading about these figures as saying, you can play this role, you can be a political figure, not just a merely a cricket figure. He also, of course, dedicates the book partly to W.G. Grace, the only one he dedicates it to who he did not know, never saw play. And of course, part of what he's trying to do there is to right a wrong, which he's also doing with regard to Leary Constantine, that sports are neglected. They're not seen as part of culture. They're not seen as part of high culture, part of the way we human beings make sense of the world and transform it in various ways and transform our relationships to other people. Although he plays his role in the circulation of the public school ethic and ethos, Grace himself didn't go to public school. And so he's an interesting figure in relation to Dr. Arnold and to Thomas Hughes as well. And so this is the Grace that I want to kind of investigate. Grace was not only a great cricketer and considered by the time he was 21 by all the great guides, the Lillywhite guides and something in the 1860s and Wisden, as the greatest cricketer and certainly the greatest batsman that ever existed by the time he was 19 or 20. He also became a much broader figure. And you can see here, Celebrities at Home. This was originally published in a newspaper called The World in 1877, but you can also notice it ended up in the Mercury in Hobart in Tasmania. So he was not only a national figure, he was an imperial figure. You also might like to notice on the right-hand side, it's a portrait from the magazine Vanity Fair, and no doubt there are some interesting connections to be made with Vanity Fair Thackeray and that magazine that started in 1868. Other people, of course, used then this broader figure. He was not just a cricket figure, he was a cultural figure, a social figure, perhaps the best known person in Victorian England and elsewhere, because he was also used by commercial entities, Hudson Soap, Coleman's Mustard, and cigarette companies to sell their product. So we can see intermediating figures using the well-knownness of him as a cricket figure, as representing certain social values and norms, to sell products and to engage in the world in various ways. And that's the representative figure that I'm kind of exploring, and I'm suggesting that in a way he might require further investigation. The account which C.L.R. James gives really of Victorian England is a kind of Whig history of largely of democratic progress and things like that. And I'm suggesting some supplementation at the very least to that particular account. One of the things I'm also going to suggest to you is that the social significance of this figure is connected to, in very powerful ways, to figures that you wouldn't expect them to be associated with. Asa Briggs, in his 1983 Social History of England, has written a paragraph on the links between Oscar Wilde and W.G. Grace, and yet in 1895, when Oscar Wilde was the villain, W.G. Grace was the hero, and the strange and subtle kind of nuances of identification and meanings that were circulated there are really, really intriguing. We can see also that W.G. Grace was once a young man who played cricket with enormous vigour. He maintained his vigour into his kind of 50s, but he looked like this older figure and became known as the grand old man, as sort of tribute to Gladstone, who was also known in the same way. And I did a whole paper on this at a social history conference, so you're only getting little bits that illuminate this issue to do with the representative figure. So, James, boyhood reading Victorian papers and magazines, we saw in the documentary, the omnibus documentary, the captain, boy's own paper and so forth. What I want us to focus on is the mediations that are going on there, where certain entities, the Religious Tract Society, the MCC itself, are using that image and nuancing the identity and the meanings in certain kinds of ways. So what are the issues for James's model? W.G. Grace and Oscar Wilde and a normative social status of masculinity being represented in certain ways, W.G. Grace and Oscar Wilde and the boundaries being made and remade again between athletics and aesthetics and creating a binary and saying, well, actually the two don't belong together, which obviously goes against C.L.R. James's aspirations. You want to bring these things together as part of the possibilities of human being. I also suggest that James's use of Hegel, unnamed, Rousseau, unnamed in Beyond the Boundary, for conceptualizing representation are not the best ways of getting at it, and I'll suggest why in a little moment. Timeline, Oscar Wilde, W.G. Grace. If we look at 25th of May, second criminal trial of Oscar Wilde, 2 years hard labour. On exactly the same date, W.G. Grace finished a game, Gloucestershire versus Kent at Gravesend, scored 257, 73 not out. It was his 101st first-class century. And it was on the ground, it was on the pitch, it was standing on in the playing area for all 3 days of the match. First time it had ever been done in cricket history. And previously, on the 9th of May, made his 99th, then 288, his 100th century. So in the build-up towards finding eventually Oscar Wilde guilty of indecency, the word sodomy was actually used in the trials, but it was never used in the newspapers. So he was found guilty of indecency, sentenced to 2 years hard labour, and Grace's masculine identity was identified as the heroic version against certain of the kind of meanings of Oscar Wilde. After Oscar Wilde was found guilty, some people say, oh, they stopped covering him in newspapers. It's not true. Much less coverage of him. But what he went through was a series of ritual humiliations. Bankruptcy, his name removed from playbills, his children given another name, his household effects sold off, and then eventually made bankrupt on exactly the same day that W.G. Grace became the recipient of the money from the National Shilling Testimonial. So if we go on the right-hand side, thinking about the W.G. Grace made these miraculous hundreds. People didn't think you could ever do that. 1,000 runs in May. People thought he should have a knighthood. People thought that he should then have a National Shilling Testimonial where at a popular level, even relatively poor people could pay, save up and send off their little shilling. And this was launched by the Daily Telegraph against another testimonial of the MCC and Gloucestershire County Cricket Club. And Daily Telegraph and Punch did various panegyrics to Grace, but articulated who he was and his identity in various kinds of interesting ways. And I want to particularly focus in the Punch account on the aesthetic athletic division and so forth. So, a poem from the 13th of April on the left-hand side in which Oscar Wilde is associated with Orientalism, or the Oriental, and with Hellenism, and these are considered to be antithetical to the English race and to the kind of manhood that you were trying to articulate as the dominant kind of manhood. And what do we need? As we go further down, plaid sturdy Britons, we need Philistines to counter Orientalism and Hellenism, and we need to purge the signs that England ere such noxious offspring bore. This is before Oscar Wilde was found guilty, but he was treated as guilty in the newspapers from the very time he was associated with a scandal. Second one, a few months further on in August, now we suddenly find that W.G. Grace is John Bull. He is the plain, sturdy Briton. He is the Philistine who's going to work against this Oriental and Hellenic kind of decadence and effeteness. And you see right at the bottom, then here's for cricket in this year of grace. So grace suddenly dominates the year and what it means. Fair play all round, straight hitting and straight dealing. And suddenly the kind of straight, bent, gay, and those kind of things come to the fore. More for us, perhaps, than for the Victorians. In letters and morals, arts and commonplace, reversion into type indeed and feeling, a path of true reaction to retrace. So it's not just about the boundaries between aesthetic and athletics, it's also the boundaries between reimagining society. This is against radicalism of all sorts of types. And Oscar Wilde was not just associated with aesthetic radicalism, he's associated with feminism and all sorts of new developments in ways of living. How does the Daily Telegraph deal with it? In October, when they give him the money, the £5,000 cheque, Sir Edward Lawson, the editor of the Daily Telegraph, says, I want to tell you, this is a really worthy kind of thing. Or everybody in the country, the masses, the classes and masses alike, prefer honest and wholesome amusements to sickly pleasures. This is a reference to Oscar Wilde, and these are in the same places on the page. Also adds a little kind of conservative go against the Puritans, the sort of liberals, I suppose, puritanical gloom, conferring upon you, Sir W. Grace, the happy distinction of a substantial personal tribute, which is at the same time a public approval of your salutary example to the youth and manhood of our time. Since that the youth and manhood being articulated against aesthetics, against radicalism, against all sorts of other things that question the simplicity of that honest and wholesome kind of interaction. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly. I think there are two unnamed accounts going on of what this representative figure is. And I think there's Hegel's theory of recognition, and if you know Axel Honesworth, you'll know it's not just in the phenomenology of spirit, it's also there in his earlier work. Bondsman stroke, my little thrall thrilled with recognition and delight. Grace in 1895, the universal merged in the individual. And there's also Rousseau's general will. They played as if they know their club represented the great mass of black people in the island, the Shannon Club. We should be free to govern ourselves, the democratic imperative of that Rousseau distinctively brought to political thought. But the kind of identification with the side where the general will is meant to be a consensual agreement to an overall kind of view. And you'll note also that this progress of civilization can actually, even though the aesthetic faculty for C.L.R. James is an innate faculty, of course, civilization can get in the way and disbar you from being able to articulate and use your aesthetic faculty, and therefore it can be more or less developed. So what would be a better account of the representative claim? Here I draw on Michael Soward's work, where he sort of talks about political representation, but he suggests in recent times political representation has transformed in all sorts of ways. It's not just about elected representatives, it's increasingly about people we feel represent us, connect to us, cultural and other figures. And particularly this has been researched in the area of popular musicians who have gathered together, in a sense, solidarity communities around themselves. So what does his analysis look like? It's not unified, and it does involve intermediary actions, and this is the kind of things which I think C.L.R. James' account is relatively lacking at a general level. A maker of representations puts forward a subject which stands for an object which is related to a referent and is offered to an audience. So we're thinking here that there's cultural codes going on here and sets of meanings being made. We can see on the right-hand side that it's a model of representation and of the representative claim which is significantly overlaps with at least the kind of major thrust of C.L.R. James. It is aesthetic and cultural, it's dynamic, it's performative, but it raises questions about exactly what series of practices and events are involved in making representation. So what does this actually look like if we use W.G. Grace as an example? On the left-hand side at the bottom, I give an account as if we're just talking about representative claim. On the right-hand side, I try to give it as a mediated representative claim to see what difference the Daily Telegraph and the Punch might make to our account and thinking this through. W.G. Grace, if we think of him as the maker of these representations, whether it's his actions, it's him making the game, or is it him writing newspaper articles or for magazine articles. He offers himself as a subject, as an embodiment of national identity, which is the object, but the object is ever known through sense cultural codes, through reference, and it's been offered to a constituency, spectators, audience, and they might accept it, they may not accept it. If we think about the mediated representative claim, which I'm suggesting we need to think about intermediary relations and practices, W.G. Grace and or newspapers offer him, W.G. Grace, as the embodiment of manly, not effeminate, national or imperial identity, the object, which is known through various ideas of the object, various cultural codes, various reference to manliness, various reference to the boundaries between aesthetics and athletics, and is offered to constituencies. In other words, we have to think about a differentiated reading publics in different places, maybe even reading publics across empire, since these images were offered to Australia and received differently in Australia and South Africa and so on and so forth. So, that's it. That's as far as I go. Okay.
Thanks, Neil. Our second speaker is Tony Bateman. Has connections with De Montfort University, and the title of his talk, Far From It Look Like Politics, C.L.R. James and the Canon of English Cricket Literature.
I ought to explain where this paper actually comes from. It's a highly abridged take on a chapter that I wrote on C.L.R. James in a book I've written, which is fundamentally a cultural history of cricket writing. So I'm just trying to kind of take a different approach to James's work, to kind of question or to ask the question, where does he fit in or not into a longer tradition of cricket writing that goes back as far as the 1740s. And it seems to me that since James's death in 1989, there's been a flurry of scholarly articles and books written about him. But I think there's been very little attention paid to his relationship to this great, or I say great, long, certainly, tradition of English cricket writing. And particularly the work of Neville Cardus, or Sir Neville Cardus. He was the first cricket writer to be knighted, and a friend of James, and of course a figure who gave James his first work as a cricket writer for the Manchester Guardian. I talk about a canon of cricket writing. What do I mean by that? James loves cricket and heroic poem. It's the first poem in English written about the sport, from the 1740s. Mary Mitford, Our Village, that's 1824. That's the first full-length prose description of a cricket match. John Nyland's The Cricketers of My Time, first published in serial form in 1832. And I playfully suggest that this is a kind of founding text of cricket writing and therefore makes Nyland cricket's Chaucer. James Pycroft, The Cricket Field, 1851, a very significant text in the shift of meaning that overcomes cricket during the Victorian period, and a text that James refers to. Thomas Hughes' Tom Bowles' School Days, the sacred text of Victorianism, as James described it. Obviously not exclusively a text about cricket, but one in which the sport plays a major part. Ranjit Singh's The Jubilee Book of Cricket, probably a book actually written in large part by C.B. Fry, who I shall come on to later. And then essays by Andrew Lang, who was actually a Scotsman, E.V. Lucas, and again C.B. Fry. Cardus, I playfully suggest, is cricket Shakespeare. C.L.R. James, Milton ? I just, again, playfully suggest that perhaps he's a man in this country who's greatly admired for his knowledge of the sport, but whose revolutionary politics remain somewhat of an embarrassment, rather like Milton. And then John Arlott, another great friend of James's, I don't know, whose West Country background. I playfully suggest again that he's some kind of hardy figure, but don't take those labels too seriously. As I've said, critics have correctly identified the relationship of James's work, both to the English literary canon, particularly Thackeray, which he acknowledges was a great influence on him, and to other Marxist cultural theorists. But I think there's, largely this relationship to the tradition of English cricket writing has been overlooked. And I find this particularly surprising, given this passage in Beyond a Boundary, which I'm sure many of you will know. This is at the beginning of the chapter, What is Art? I have made great claims to cricket. As firmly as I'm able, and is here possible, I've integrated it in the historical movements of the times. The question remains, what is it? Is it mere entertainment, or is it an art? Mr. Neville Cardus, whose work deserves a critical study, is here most illuminating, not as subject but as object. He will ask, why do we deny the art of the cricketer and rank it lower than the vocalists or fiddlers? If anybody tells me that R.H. Spooner did not compel a pleasure as aesthetic as any compelled by the most cultivated Italian tenor that ever lived, I will write him down a purist and an ass. He says the same in more than one place. And finally he says, yet he can write in his autobiography, I do not believe that anything fine in music or in anything else can be understood or truly felt by the crowd. We're back with F.R. Leavis, I think, to some extent, from yesterday's fascinating talk. Now, I think there are a number of points to be drawn from this passage. First, James's advocacy of a critical study of Cardus acknowledges and reinforces the importance of this figure in the cricket canon. It also reveals that James himself was an important figure in the critical valorisation of Cardus. Furthermore, his claim has the additional value of drawing attention to the need for a study of cricket writing more generally. One of the main arguments of Beyond a Boundary, I feel, is that sport and its discourses merit and demand attention. Second, James's critique of Cardus's aesthetic places cricket and its discourses at the heart of a significant debate. Like theorists such as Raymond Williams and later Pierre Bourdieu, James understood the opposition between high and popular culture as a historically specific construction. The concept of art that arose from these conditions, James believed, became the privileged term in a binary opposition between it and the degraded concept of the popular. James fully acknowledged that Cardus rendered cricket as an art form at the level of discourse, but totally rejected his claim that its aesthetic subtleties were beyond the understanding of the sport's mass spectatorship. Indeed, for James, the relatively unmediated experience of the crowd was positively constitutive of cricket's meaning as a cultural form. Although the aesthetic had been a constant feature of cricket literature ever since its emergence, in Beyond a Boundary, James described its manifestations as, quote, impressionistic or apologetic, timid or defiant, always ready to take refuge in the mysticism of metaphor. I think James had in his sight writers like Cardus who sought to argue for the sport's status as art simply by a process of cultural illusion and the fluidity of their prose style. James elaborated this aesthetic tradition by offering a more rigorous and historicised theory of cultural equivalence in which aesthetic factors are given a properly historical and materialist context. But even here, Cardus was important for James because his occasionally acute understanding of the relationship between cricket and its social and economic context could be accommodated dialectically within his Hegelian Marxist schema. For example, in Beyond a Boundary, James praises Cardus's assessment of W.G. Grace as a representative man of his epoch, but notes that he failed to comprehend exactly what Grace represented, particularly to those living in the alienating conditions of Britain's industrial towns and cities. He says, as usual, it is Mr. Neville Cardus, in his vivid, darting style, who has got closest to W.G. He quotes Cardus, the plain, lusty humours of his first practices in the Gloucestershire orchard were to be savoured throughout the man's gigantic rise to national renown. And then we hear James again, only it was not the plain, lusty humours of an orchard, but of a whole way of life. Cardus again, he rendered rusticity cosmopolitan whenever he returned to it, and always did he cause to blow over the fashionable pleasances of St. John's. James again, there they needed it least. It was to bleak Sheffield, to dusty Kennington, and to grim Manchester that W.G. brought the life they had left behind. The breezes stirred by his bat had blown in their faces north, south and east, as well as in the west. I think the passage is crucial. We might easily read it and not think too much of it, but it establishes James's argument for a popular aesthetic that will cut through the false distinction between high and low culture. In fact, it could be said that the definition of culture here rendered is exactly the same as Raymond Williams' idea of a whole way of life. Here James simultaneously admires Cardus's prose while critiquing his narrow definition of culture in such a way that exemplifies his ambivalent relationship to the English cricket canon. James's critique of Cardus and his intervention into the English cricket canon not only sought to democratise the notion of a cricket aesthetic, but was a quest for a suitable, non-racialised literary means of accounting for the embodied performance of West Indies cricket. James was highly conscious of the convention of representation that sublimated matters of cricketing style, or in James's aesthetic, significant form, into racialised binaries. James's subversion of the canon, his rearticulation of the game's aesthetic discourses, and his quest for suitable literary means of representing non-white players, I think were crystallised in his 1969 essay, Garfield Sobers, a piece that originally appeared in John Arlett's collection, The Great All-Rounders. Sobers was unquestionably one of the greatest cricketers of all time, a superb all-round player, a superb batsman, an outstanding fielder, and a player capable of bowling slow, fast, medium pace or spin. In the essay, James characteristically situates this phenomenal cricketer in his particular cultural and social space, and explicitly positions his own analysis against conventional metropolitan interpretations of Sobers. The pundits colossally misunderstood Garfield Sobers. Perhaps the word should be misinterpret, not misunderstand. Garfield Sobers, I shall show, is a West Indian cricketer, not merely a cricketer from the West Indies. He is the most typical West Indies cricketer that is possible to imagine. All geniuses are merely people who carry to an extreme definitive characteristics of the unit of civilization to which they belong, and the special act or function which they express or practice. Therefore, to misunderstand Sobers is to misunderstand the West Indies, if not by intention, by inherent disposition, which is much worse. And then he goes on to mildly criticise Dennis Robotham of The Guardian for the kind of frame of reference that he uses in writing about Sobers, and I'll come on to that a little bit more in a minute. I think James criticises Robotham because he senses in his writing the unconscious racism that he saw permeated English cricket discourse. James then goes on to show that Sobers' remarkable talents are not racial, but, quote, the fine fruit of a great tradition. Sorry to say it, but F.R. Leavis again. A tradition that includes not only great West Indies players such as Leary Constantine and George Headley, but English masters such as W.G. Grace and Walter Hammond. A Sobers innings is thus read as an expression of a cultural hybridity that is the inevitable result of the historical experience of colonialism. To an extent, James's representation of Sobers involved gestures towards the Romantic poets and Shakespeare in a way that a writer like Cardus would do. It was jealousy, nay, political hatred, which prompted Cassius to say to Caesar, then he quotes Shakespeare, "Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonourable graves." Then we're back with James. Certainly in the press box watching Sobers, a mere scribe is aware of Hazlitt's, then he quotes Hazlitt, greatness is great power, producing great effects. It is not enough that a man has great power in himself, he must show it all to the world in a manner that cannot be hid or gainsaid. Of a famous racket player, he did not seem to follow the ball, but the ball seemed to follow him. Hazlitt would not have minded the appropriation of this acute simplicity for Sobers at short leg to Gibbs. Fantastic. Now, this density of literary allusion is different, I think, from how Cardus. In Cardus, we have what Pierre Bourdieu would call a circuit of interlegitimation. I don't think this is with James at all. James pointedly appropriates a frame of literary reference, usually preserved in the work of writers like Cardus, for the English amateur batsman of the Golden Age. With its archaisms and concentration of literary references, the passage is, in a way, thoroughly Cardus-like. And it deliberately draws attention to the act of literary representation. But the literary works that James selects, the literary works that mediate Sobers' bodily performance, are very carefully selected for their political as well as their purely aesthetic resonances. Like Shakespeare's Caesar, James's Sobers is a political figure whose power, as expressed in the cricket field, is emblematic of the appropriation of political power that was Caribbean independence. And the significance of Hazlitt, of course, is that, like James, he saw culture in a broad, non-exclusive sense, and conceived aesthetic experience as emanating from diverse practices within a broadly defined cultural spectrum. And as you know, I'm sure, Hazlitt's essay on the rackets player Kavanagh was greatly admired by James and is discussed at some length in Beyond a Boundary. Although Sobers is aestheticised through a density of allusions to the English literary canon, James's rhetorical tactic also involves, in my view, a counterbalancing empiricism and a highly controlled textual economy of style. He thus very deliberately positioned himself in relationship to the cricket canon again, but this time he fuses the aestheticism of Cardus with the more analytical literary approach of the remarkable all-round sportsman and journalist C.B. Fry, a figure believed by Cardus to be, quote, the acutest thinker ever known to the game. C.B. Fry, of course, played for Sussex in England as an opening batsman, played in a FA Cup final for Southampton as a footballer, held various athletic records at one stage, and apparently was good enough to represent England at rugby union, but presumably didn't have time. But he was also a prolific journalist and writer, and a great friend of Ranjit Singh, of course, as well. In his own words, Fry's approach to cricket writing set out to, quote, present a large number of particular instances and from them work back to such generalities as are warranted by facts. Brought up on a diet of Fry's prolific journalism, James admired admired this method, and he regarded Fry, as he told Stuart Hall, as one of the finest non-intellectual writers of the 20th century. Now, in the following passage from the Garfield Sobers essay, nothing, particularly the pithy single-sentence paragraphs, could be further from Cardus's purple prose and the belles-lettres emphasis on style over content. I find this, in its own way, one of the most remarkable passages in what is a remarkable essay. In 1964, his last season for South Australia, Sobers, against Western Australia, bowled batsman number 1 for 12 and had batsman number 2, caught by wicketkeeper Jarman for 2. Against Queensland, Jarman caught number 2 off Sobers for 5, and Sobers bowled number 3 for 1. Against the history-making New South Wales side, Sobers had Thomas number 1, caught by Lil for 0. And then it just carries on in this vein. It is impossible to find within recent years another fast bowler who in big cricket so regularly dismissed for little or naught the opening batsman on the other side. That's one paragraph. His action as a pace bowler is the most orthodox that I know. That's another paragraph, a single sentence. To me, the passage omits what Cardus described as Fry's dry light of science. Here, James's arid and pointedly unpoetic presentation of empirical observation about Sobers' technique, along with this almost overload of statistical data, is thus nothing less than a formal device. At the level of literary form, therefore, a balance of the aesthetic with the ascetic challenges the colonialist assumption of much English cricket writing that West Indies cricket was merely carnival cricket, carefree, spontaneous, but undisciplined. The key words in James's description are orthodoxy, discipline, classical. He says he's the most orthodox of great batsmen. His aggressive play is very disciplined, and no time is there anything but orthodoxy carried to the penultimate degree where orthodoxy itself disappears in the absolute. His captaincy has the same measured, one might say classical character. This rewriting of Sobers debunks the English prejudice that West Indies players are lacking in discipline and technique. Furthermore, whereas English writers such as Cardus interpreted players such as Constantine as beyond the boundary of the classical metropolitan cricketing tradition, James places Sobers in a tradition of classical batsmanship and bowling, a tradition he holds to be both English and West Indian, and is therefore able to pointedly assert there is nothing of the panther in the batting of Sobers. To be capable, rather, of reining in such naturally aggressive tendencies requires immense self-discipline and self-governance. James fully understood that at this moment of West Indies decolonisation, there were metropolitan detractors who regarded the people of the Caribbean as inherently incapable of ruling themselves. Sobers' self-disciplined, highly cerebral cricket and James's controlled, Fry-inspired prose symbolically and literally suggest otherwise. Art, as manifest in Sobers' cricket and James's writing, is thus nothing less than a metaphor of the West Indian aptitude for rational self-governance. In this Sobers essay, James was therefore concerned to find the appropriate literary register through which the cultural and political significance of this cricket could be conveyed. This was a skillful and conscious and active position-taking within the canon, as was James's earlier entry into the field of American studies. I'm talking there, of course, about Mariners, Renegades and Castaways. James's aesthetic emerged from within the boundaries of the English cricket canon and went beyond the permissible limits of this discourse by refusing to disavow its politics. When viewed from the perspectives of the margins of the former empire, cricket refuses to be the apolitical field it is constructed as in English literary culture. When James wrote of Sobers, he being what he is and I being what I am, for me, his command of the rising ball and the drive, his close fielding, and his hurling himself into his fast bowling are a living embodiment of centuries of a tortured history. He provided a structured interpretation of a text in which a particular reenactment of cricket's performative grammar gives expression to collective historical experience. Only a sophisticated popular art form like cricket, James argues, is able to convey such a complex historicity. And this in turn demands a more sophisticated critical practice on the part of its chroniclers and analysts. He wrote that Mr. Neville Cardus circumscribes his vision of Lancashire and Yorkshire professionals within the muse of comedy. Their West Indian counterparts would crack any such limitations like eggshells. Everything they were came into cricket with them. The bounded conventions of English cricket writing are thus wholly inadequate as a means of writing a distinctively Caribbean mode of play, because that distinctive style was a complex mediation of an accretion of shared historical experience. Referring to conventional interpretations of Constantine, James wrote, "We are still in the flower garden of the gay, the spontaneous, tropical West Indians. We need some astringent spray." This astringent spray is a method of cricket criticism, both empirical and theoretical, underpinned by a materialist understanding of history and conveyed in a prose style that is itself the dialectically produced expression of historical processes. Constantine and Sobers' bodily performances are homologous with the literary enterprise of James, who took up a position within the field of English cricket discourse in order to reconfigure it and to radically rewrite cricket as a democratic and post-colonial cultural practice. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. I hope I won't cross over Tony's boundaries too much. A thought struck me late last night. I was falling asleep, as they so often do when the hot breath of a deadline fogs up a journalist's brain and only a break from the keyboard can permit a flash of clarity. Sports writers can be divided more or less, in my view, into those who love their subject too well, so enthralled to the glory, the beauty and the drama and the pain of defeat, that they are unable or unwilling to see its flaws and injustices, and those who do so wisely. C.L.R. James, to me, in the main, was the anti-Othello. What do they know who only cricket know? What can they know who only cricket know? Over the next few minutes, I'll be looking briefly at C.L.R. the writer, sports writer, but more importantly, his influence on those who followed as sports writers, and including myself. Now, the first cricket writers to see beyond the two-dimensional, claimed the estimable former editor of Wisden Cricketer's Almanac, Shiel Berry, in his contribution to a wide-ranging homage to the breed that I had the privilege to edit, the New Ball Volume 5, were Sir Neville Cardus and Raymond Robertson Glasgow. Both began expounding their views before Henry Verwoerd formally imposed apartheid, significantly challenging cricket and rugby writers to question their priorities, a challenge manfully resisted by all but a minuscule minority. Cardus and Robertson Glasgow perceived the human side, Berry elaborated, the character of a cricketer, Cardus as a subjective impression, Robertson Glasgow from objective experience on the field as a Somerset player. Neither, though, went beyond the field of play to see the place where the cricketer was born and brought up, where he went to school, or what community he represented. The first to do this, in Berry's reading of the game, was C.L.R. James. Sports writing's most conspicuous Marxist, Berry continued, was the first to see and write about cricketers in their social context. Take the following extract from Beyond the Boundaries chapter, The Most Unkindest Cut of All, wherein he meets St Hill's avid supporters. One afternoon, I was walking in the country with a bat in my hand when I passed a shoemaker's shop with a few men gossiping by the door. I had gone some yards when the shoemaker himself came running after me, all in hand. "Excuse me, sir," he said, "but are you Mr. St Hill?" I looked at the group by the door. All were watching intently. I had to say no, and he was sadly disappointed, as I was. I went back to talk. None of them had ever seen St Hill, but they worshipped him. They knew my name and that I not only played, but wrote in the papers. I told them what I thought of St Hill's batting. Their enthusiasm boiled over. One said weightily, "You know what I'm waiting for? When he go to Lord's in the Oval and make his century there. That's what I want to see." I have to repeat, it took me years to understand. To paraphrase a sentence, it was the instinct of an oppressed man that spoke. As Robert Hill argued, the theme of vindication supplies one of the important keys to comprehending the intellectual purpose of C.L.R. James. In other words, warranted Berry, James was trying to talk up Afro-Caribbeans, whether cricketers or anyone else, for the purposes of his fight against racial discrimination. Now, of the sports writers who have carried James's torch, consciously or otherwise, three, for this observer, loom largest. And by no means simply because I know them all pretty well, or that two of them, like me, had a bar mitzvah, or that the plaque outside the University of Brighton's main newsroom bears the third's name. In order of seniority, they are Andrew Jennings, an Englishman vigorous and single-minded in his zeal, for holding up, maybe veal, for holding up to ridicule the greed and corruption of sport's biggest badders ringmasters, the IOC and FIFA. Most prominently and potently through TV documentaries, investigations for the Daily Mail, and scathing hardback tracts such as Foul, The Secret World of FIFA, and The Lords of the Rings, Power, Money and Drugs in the Modern Olympics. Secondly, Mike Marquesee, an Anglo-American journalist, activist, author of several charged and compelling books examining the sport society nexus, including an acclaimed study of Muhammad Ali and race, Redemption Song, and two brilliant cricket books, Anyone But England and War Minus the Shooting. And thirdly, Dave Zirin, a full-time American whose fiery columns for The Nation and Huffington Post, not to mention unflinching books such as A People's History of Sport in the United States and Bad Sports, How Owners Are Ruining the Games We Love, single him out as the most energetic and trenchant of all American campaigning sports writers. Now, it is telling that Jones is alone among this illustrious trio in having been on the full-time staff of a major national newspaper, and most of the time he was employed as a sub-editor rather than reporter. After all, keeping politics off the sports pages, with the occasional exception of Olympic matters, has only stopped the default policy relatively recently. Fortunately, the internet, via Jennings's website transparencyinsport.org, Zirin's edgeofsports.com and Marquesee's online op-eds for The Guardian, has been an undoubted boon. Their motivation? Based in London for the past 4 decades, Marquesee describes himself as a deracinated Marxist of American Jewish background, which gives him 3 spurs straight off the bat. Another New Yorker of Semite stock, Zirin is a pea from an adjacent pod. Jennings is one of those old-fashioned journalists for whom podcasts and picture bylines reek of everything wrong with what he, as unpretentious journalists invariably do, regards as a trade rather than a profession. He was driven by a natural journalist's thirst for a good story and a wrong worth exposing. C.L.R., he told me, did me a special favour, introducing me to a world of politics, racism, struggle and beautiful narratives. And I'd never understood cricket before him. And then he researched and wrote Black Jacobins. He didn't get a lot of work then, and he'd struggle even more in today's world of sports reporter illiteracy, mainly intellectual. Marquesee, in my view, comes closest to a contemporary C.L.R. James. He has written extensively about him too, and captures beyond the boundaries enduring appeal as well as anyone. He writes, "As innovative in form as it is in content, Beyond the Boundary is uncategorizable. Yet for all its diversity, it has what many of today's hybrid texts lack, a commanding intelligence and a distinctive voice, dry, purposeful, thrillingly and theatrically didactic." Marquesee rebuts the charge that C.L.R.'s reverence for the English public school ethic was evidence of that occasional philosophical inconsistency. What he saw in this ethic, as embodied in cricket, he wrote, was something that fit the needs of an emergent West Indian society, a self-discipline that was part of the struggle for freedom and equality. In his view, West Indians were not only victims of imperialism, but agents able to seize the tools of the oppressor and use them for self-assertion and self-development. That's the lens through which he understands cricket. In its stories, he sees West Indians adopting and adapting the culture and technology of their masters, making it their own, turning its disciplines to their own purposes. Dave Zirin came to see C.L.R. as a totem. Beyond the Boundary, he assured me, is one of the greatest sports books ever written, as if I needed convincing. Even if one knows nothing about cricket, he continued, speaking from vast experience, it provides a method for understanding sport and culture in a way that is truly profound. Every time I pick it up, I learn something new. Now, confession time. Personally, C.L.R. was an inspiration. Along with Cardus, he came to represent, for me, for many years, the opposing poles of sports writing. You could be reductionist, even simplistic, and classify them both as celebratory and worldly, or simply bringers of joy and pain, though employing these descriptions alone would do both an injustice. In fact, as I've come to realise, the similarities probably outweigh the differences. In his account of the 1936-37 Ashes tour, Cardus learned and divulged much about the Australian people, however narrow and selective his focus might now seem. C.L.R. found the beauty and the unifying in cricket as well as the ugly and the divisive. The following passage from 1932, wherein he pays homage to the great bowler S.F. Barnes, still out thinking, bamboozling and defeating men half his age at a ripe 59, could just as easily have sprung from Cardus's potent imagination and flair for poetic portraiture. He is tall and thin, well over 6 feet, with strong features. It is a rather remarkable face in its way and could belong to a great lawyer or a statesman without incongruity. He holds his head well back, with the rather long chin lifted. He looks like a man who has seen as much of the world as he wants to. Now, perhaps because cricket, by comparison with politics and race, served in some ways as a relief from more serious matters, C.L.R.'s outlook, as with Cardus, was that of an old-fashioned Anglophile. He too was a showy writer. He too chose words for their own sake, sometimes with greater emphasis on style than literal accuracy. To take one extreme example, his use of the word revolting in a passionate and occasionally vituperative 1960 column for The Nation, wielded to describe the continued preference for Jerry Alexander over Frank Worrell as West Indies captain, showcased both his desire for impact and his willingness to use expressions without full regard for the variety of possible interpretations. He was taken to task, in this case by Alan Ross of The Observer, and duly admitted and apologised for his error. At first, like so many, I wanted to be the new Cardus, in part because we both loved music as much as cricket, mostly because of his painterly and distinctive use of words. Diplomatic by nature, constantly wary of causing offence, I wanted to be in print what I couldn't be in life. But for Cardus and irreverent New Musical Express scribes such as Nick Kent and Charles Shaw Murray, I would never have contemplated, much less pursued, an ambition to be the first rock and roll cricket writer. Now, you may or may not be surprised to know that this was not an entirely sensible approach. The first time I ever heard the word florid was in 1987, shortly after I began my first job in Fleet Street, when the deputy sports editor of the short-lived London Daily News deployed it to describe one of my football match reports. At first, I steadfastly refused to believe that the word existed. When I discovered that it did, and realised that he may have had a small point, I declined to take it as the insult intended. Nobody told Cardus to play a straighter bat. Why should I be any different? Such stubbornness proved costly at times, but inevitably. But the yes pleases, fortunately, always just about outnumbered the no thank yous or never darken my door agains. Rereading Beyond the Boundary at the end of the 1990s stirred a change of heart. Not a radical one, but one I believe achieved a slightly better balance. Thanks in good part to my initial reading of the book, the why, rather than the who, what, where, and when, was always my chief concern. Then came the how, as in how I presented facts and opinions. What adjectives should I choose? What song lyric or snatch of movie dialogue should I quote? Why not just invent a word, just for the hell of it? Rereading Beyond the Boundary curbed at least some of that vanity. Thanks to C.L.R., tackling politics, especially racial politics, had long been a motivation. No wonder I wound up writing about, primarily, cricket. No sport, after all, so frequently thrust together white and non-white combatants, former imperial masters and ex-colonial subjects. But now, upon rereading Beyond the Boundary, I found myself thinking less about how I was expressing myself and more about what I was expressing. More seasoned and confident, and hence no longer feeling quite such an urge to prove myself, content began to take precedence over presentation. Now that sport has mushroomed into a multi-billion dollar industry, one with far-reaching social and economic ramifications and protected by an ultra-efficient PR industry, the need for questions to be asked and answers demanded is more pressing, I believe, than ever. Andrew Jennings is quite right to bemoan the lassitude and superficiality of so much modern sports writing, which in some quarters has become a willing cog, such a willing cog, in that infernal PR machine. But there are encouraging signs for all that, both in the rise of long-form journalism and the growing band of 20 and 30-somethings, my students among them, who have already seen too much to have any vestige of rose tinting their glasses. Only a few weeks ago I read a brilliant, searching piece about the continued struggles of black African cricketers in South Africa by Ferdows Munda in a terrific new quarterly journal from the Wisden stable, the Night Watchman. That same publication even granted me fully 8,000 words, an unthinkable number for a cricket journalist denied the freedom of a book, to try and compress C.L.R.'s life and work into something digestible. I hope I did him justice, but I also hope I captured the man rather than the legend. His legacy, I feel, certainly shows no sign of abating.
Just a quick comment and then a general inquiry. The comment actually refers to that passage there about Sobers hurling him bowling. In fact, Sobers was the most beautiful fast bowler I have seen until Michael Holding. So hurling is not quite right,
No.
unless he's using it metaphorically, hurling himself out of society into fast bowling. The other general question, if anybody knows, is what was James's attitudes to the banning of bodyline when West Indians used it against the English cricket team and broke the jaw of R.E.S. Wyatt, the England captain, while it had been defended when it was used against the Australians, and of course nearly made Australia leave the empire. Because in a sense this might have been something in the 30s which would have brought his anti-imperialism into play, his looking at the significance of cricket outside of that. Of course he's writing in the Manchester Guardian and the World. So just an inquiry for anybody.
One thing I find slightly surprising about Beyond the Boundaries' coverage of Bodyline in the chapter The Decline of the West, I think James tends to concentrate on Bodyline as somehow an expression of the violence and ferocity of the age expressing itself in the cricket field. Almost reading it more as an anticipation or perhaps an expression of politics going on in Europe at the time, somehow, as rather than seeing it in those imperial terms. That's my reading of it. So perhaps if I revisit it, I might see something else.
Sorry, I didn't phrase my question correctly. What I wanted to know was whether he responded at the time, not in the...
At the time, sure, yes.
Which is a retrospective look back.
Well, I guess he'd only just started writing, hadn't he?
No, okay, but in 1936 he was writing. And it was the 1936
It's 1932 to 33.
Yeah, but he's talking about the West Indies one. I know 34-5 is the 34.
Okay, yeah.
Bans came into place.
Yeah, 33 is in Martindale. Yeah, that's who you're referring to. I mean, the only point I would say about this is he defended Larwood. You know, he thought very highly of Larwood and didn't see him in any way in a poor light, which in a sense that makes it not quite so inconsistent that he should be having the certain attitude that he had to the Caribbean.
And so when we began to look at those films of Larwood bowling, then a number of people remarked on Larwood's action.
I think just to add to that he also defended Jardine, who was willing to and hit a fine century against a bodyline attack himself, and wanted to press the point that there was a double standard here in the English cricket hierarchy, the elite, for which both Jardine and Larwood suffered.
Tony, I quoted from your book in my talk, and I love the way you trace the rhetoric of cricket writing and the use of colonial axiologies and binaries and so on. So my question is, do you still see that in cricket writing today? And I'd like to ask you, Rob, perhaps the same question, and also ask if you keep up with cricket writing in India about people like Sachin Tendulkar and the sort of, adoration that he gets from the Indian press, and how you respond to that. So 2 questions.
Yes, I do come across the kind of rhetoric that I discuss in the book. I think less so. I genuinely think less so. But it's as people mentioned yesterday, the representation of athletes like Usain Bolt, it's still very much in the discourse. But I do think cricket writing has perhaps generally moved on somewhat because of writers like James and Marquesi and others.
I mean, I can only support what Tony said. I mean, as a cricket writer myself, I'm very, very conscious of the fact that, when I look back 50 years, 40 years about what people weren't writing about and what we write about now, it's a very, very different game. I mean, technique gets discussed minimally. Where the politics of the game with big P, small p, whichever way you want to look at it, racial politics in particular, the explosion of cricket in India in particular, the IPL, has created a very, very interesting dynamic right now. As someone who writes for Cricinfo, which is an Indian website but nevertheless is contributed by people from all over the world, it's the best place, I don't know if you read it, but it's the place to go if you want to know about the greatest cricket debates. I find myself in a very difficult position at times because there are things that the Board of Control for Cricket in India are doing that I don't approve of, and I know a lot of people don't approve of. It's not just because I'm English, it's because of the way I believe in the sense they abuse their power. So I'm very conscious every time I sat down to write for this site, I've got to be very careful what I say because 99% of the readers are Indian. I don't want to cause offence, I do want to make people to think. Sachin Tendulkar is an example of someone who is a god in a way I don't think any other cricketer has ever been worshipped by so many people at one time, and by people who are so reluctant to see that there could possibly be any criticism of him, which I think is a little bit of a pity, but then again, not suggesting he does much wrong or there's any reason, but if you write an article and mention Tendulkar's name in anything other than absolutely reverential terms, the abuse you're going to get is quite frightening at times. But nevertheless, despite saying that, I think the growth of Indian cricket and the impact it's had on sports writing has been an enormously beneficial thing. And I think we're all very, very grateful that the passion for the game that exists there, that has fueled some very fine cricket writers. I mean, really, there's some tremendous people coming out of India who, could write a lot of colleagues of mine into the ground, frankly. But they've only recently had the global showcase, which is Cricinfo.
May I ask you a question actually about how do you feel about the cult of Tendulkar and, for instance, the flurry of publications given his 40th birthday? I'd just be interested to know your perspective.
I'll just answer briefly. My husband Raj is probably in a better position to answer that. I just see little Indian boys, like my nephews when they were boys, and how much it means to them. And, you know, Tendulkar is adulated far beyond any politician, which is a good thing, I think. So rather than indulge in that sort of adoration for politicians, which is unhealthy, I'd rather see it for a cricketer, which I think is healthier in a democracy like India.
Okay.
So,
two related points. One, many people won't be too surprised, having been identified with Yorkshire, my origins, if I make the point mainly in contrast to Neil's, that the representational characteristics of grace in particular, and I think the classic generation of gentlemen, isn't universally accepted. It is subject to regional and class differences. And of course this is a theme of Yorkshire and Northern spectators, writers, players, that we don't get a fair crack of the whip, and what is representative in the South isn't necessarily representative of England. And I think in any re-evaluation of grace, which I think is called for, and even of Beyond the Boundary, that kind of regional class distinction is worth bringing in. But it seems to me probably a more significant question is one that I sense in all three presentations and in some of the other offerings yesterday, that insofar as there is a discussion of art and aesthetics, and particularly CLR's perspective on these, I think it's worth asking, you know, what is the art, potentially, if that's the right word, that one is after? In some way, it is the art of those who write about cricket, which has been our main emphasis this morning. But particularly in Neil's thing, this moves over to the art of cricketers in their techniques. And I wonder, though, whether one ought to push this a little bit further so that it's that the art and the aesthetics of the game and the way it's played ought to be, if you like, democratized. That it's not just the art, in one of the quotes, of R.T. Spooner or of Garfield Sobers, but the art of a certain type of batting, for instance. In Beyond the Boundary, as I recall, one of C.L.R's sort of probes, and I think a bugbear, is that he doesn't like the forward defensive stroke. And he thinks in a way that's an anathema that crept into English cricket towards the end of the classic period. And I think, if I've got to comment on the whole conference, making that link, which he does, between the very techniques of the game and the broader aesthetics and the social and other contexts has perhaps been neglected. But, you know, whether it's leg theory or bouncers or the forward defensive stroke, these aren't the attributes, aesthetic or not, of any individual. They are the collective contribution of those who are playing within a certain tradition at a certain time. And this, I think, would mean that what we heard last night in the last session of the notion of work and what constitutes work, and the very act of work in a totally anonymous way by ordinary people, is part of the aesthetic that cricket has to offer. And that, okay, maybe pushing things a bit far, and it's not my particular field, but I'd be interested in what the panel has to respond.
Well, I just think we have to really clarify that what it is, when we talk about art, it's such a problematic term, and I think it makes some of my work difficult when I'm talking about art in various contexts. I think I get the sense that you're talking about art in the sense of a kind of skill more than a thing of beauty.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was
So,
going to say
yeah.
it's the B word for me.
Trade,
When you think
profession,
about sport,
skill.
you know, when you
I
think
mean, this is not my field, so I'm conscious that I'm not using the term in any rigorous way. And I'm partly throwing the question back to you.
but is it
I am looking, though, for the creativity of the collective.
creativity with the collective, and yet cricket is that great paradox in that sense. It's a team game, but it's the one-on-one individual duel. So I don't think people depend on teammates don't depend on each other to create an art as a whole. I think there were certain shots that C.L.R. admired that were beautiful shots, if you like. He probably just didn't regard a forward defensive as anything more of a sort of a mechanistic science, perhaps. No less valuable in the greater scheme of things, but was it art? Was it beauty? And I think beauty is what, when I write about sport, I know if I'm trying to convey the art of sport, it's the beauty of it, and not everything about sport is beautiful. It may be well formed, well constructed, doesn't necessarily make it beautiful, doesn't necessarily make it art.
Can I pick up on the sort of regional distinctions and things like that? I came across a very funny quote from C.B. Fry a few months ago, which is something like, Somerset will never win anything because they're always chasing after apples. So there's this notion that they were not organised cricketers, they were rural types. I imagine he meant apples and cider and the whole kind of thing like that. So you might say, if you think you've got a problem with Yorkshire's relationship to the rest of the country, you ought to differentiate the South and think about West Country cricketers, because always the discourse there is that they don't get a fair shake of the stick and they're not considered sort of by the selectors and those kind of things. But clearly there are different formations of masculinity. There's been lots written on Yorkshire cricket masculinity in recent times, and very profoundly different assumptions. You might say, some of the representative figures, and Rob and I talked about this the other day, Robert Abel, or Abel, he calls him Abel, I call him Abel, who was a great cricketer for Surrey from the 1880s to about 1904. He was not a heroic cricketer, he was a kind of Cockney sparrow. Born in Bermondsey, so not a Cockney in any sort of strict sense, son of a lamplighter. And so he was identified with more as the little man, and he was quite small, and often he would actually stand next to very tall cricketers to create a comic effect on the field, and this was then feared by the kind of tall cricketers. So you might say there are other forms of people who could be representative figures, but what are they representing? They're representing a kind of ordinariness, a kind of everydayness, a kind of underclass in a kind of way, but you know, this could happen at Surrey, that could happen at the Oval, it couldn't happen at Lords. You wouldn't have these kind of cricketers. So there are obviously different formations of identity going on in other parts of the country.
Look at the
Yeah.
middle sentence up there.
The little one. The flower garden of the gay small town.
Carter's vision of Lancashire professionals. You know, it goes unnoticed in that quote. But that is a distorting view.
Yeah, I mean the thing is that going back to the art thing quickly. I mean, Cardus didn't think the professionals were artists. Yeah. It was only the amateurs who were artists. So,
Exactly.
And C.L.R. goes on about the welfare state cricketer in England in the 50s and 60s, isn't he? You know, Dexter's an exception, Cowdery or Graveney's an exception, but essentially he sees sort of a work ethic there, but he doesn't see beauty.
I mean, the Grace played a very powerful role in a very strict separation of professional and amateur. And he was his 2 tours of Australia was very much brought up on this question, because he would not allow the professionals to be invited to any invites for drinks or things like that. It was only the amateurs. And so in a sense, him playing for MCC, identifying with MCC, is a cultural act of saying, these are strict boundaries and we'll keep them as strict as possible, probably stricter than almost any other cricketer of the time. So he had that kind of cultural impact as well. You might say with regard to Neville Cardus, the other of his writings actually talk about Johnny Tildesley as a great stylish player, maybe not the pure style of Spooner, the amateur. So some professional players are
Yeah,
parts
there
of...
were exceptions. I mean, but he would say things like, so I can't remember which player he was talking about, but he was a professional batsman, and he would say, yes, he was elegant, but not in the... this is Walter Hammond. He said of Hammond, he was elegant, but not in the inherited way that... Spooner was. I mean, it's incredible,
Well, Hammond as well was professional, amateur, professional again, wasn't it? Because you had to, it was seen to be necessary to become amateur, to become captain for certain periods of time. And if you think of Gloucestershire cricket, in time of Grace is playing, 2, maybe 3 professionals, all the rest amateurs. It's the reverse of the Yorkshire situation or the Lancashire situation, where it's 8 or 9 or 10 professionals and 1 amateur captain. So the certain of the shires are kind of more agricultural and actually more tied up with the aristocracy. So in a sense, you've got an identification with the aristocracy and the gentry going on in the very structure. The very fact that the county game replaced a professionally organised touring circuit is absolutely crucial to it. And Grace is also, plays an enormous role there of saying, well, actually, this is the exciting cricket. You want me, and if you want me, you have to buy into the county game and the MCC. And this is, it wasn't until 1885 that Grace scored 1,000 runs in the county championship. So it took until then for the county championship to be big enough to actually offer enough opportunities for players rather than those professional touring sides that had actually been started by chartists in the 1840s. And there's very little been written about chartism in cricket, but that's an interesting area that could be pursued. I've tried to get all the chartist people I know to be interested, but they never are. I always ask them, what about the cricket coverage in those chartist magazines in the 1840s? They never even paid any attention to it, and yet it was there. So chartism in cricket is an interesting, undeveloped area, which I'll never work on, because you can work on other things.
I have a question and a comment for both Rob and Anthony, whose works I've been following for a little bit. Maybe I should start with Rob's because it's maybe a simpler thing. I read Cricket Info every day, several times a day. So I've been reading your work with David Hopes and George Dobell and many others writing there. I was never aware that it's an Indian-owned operation. So I wonder if you could clarify that a little bit for me, because I don't understand the relationship between Cricinfo and the BCCI. So that's the first thing. The second is about the thing you mentioned about Tendulkar. Yes, when somebody says something that is in any way not completely positive about Tendulkar, there are a lot of harassment and comments and so on. But there is something else there, and I think you missed it, that there are many, many Indians who are calling for Tendulkar's retirement.
No.
And there are many Indians who are very, very critical of him. So there is a debate. There's not only adulation there of Tendulkar. The Indian cricketing public is a little bit more, less naive than just adulation for Tendulkar. So I think you would agree with that, Rob.
Yes, but I think it's a very recent thing, though. I really think
yes,
over
indeed.
the last,
yes,
over
indeed.
the last 6
in the
months
last
to a year. Once he got his 100th 100, I think things started to shift.
I would say it's a little bit longer than that. It goes back to about 2 years ago. I've been following this debate very closely about what's happening with Tendulkar, and an Aussie friend and I have a close discussion of what's happening on Cricinfo all the time. So I'm pretty sure it's older than that. It's about 2 years ago. Maybe you could check it up again. So maybe you could clarify that question, that point for me. If I could just go on to another question for Anthony, and maybe. When I read your work, I think back to 3 different writers in English history that I've come across. Peter Laslett, The World We Have Lost, Perry Anderson's work on an incomplete bourgeois revolution, and E.P. Thompson's work, The True-Born Englishman. And I'm saying that somehow all of them are situated there, in that pastoral village green, and so on and so forth. And the other person that I have connected in of course, a completely different way to this discourse of the English countryside is Henderson, the authentic or whatever Englishman and so on. So I wonder if you have situated your own work there while you were writing. Thanks.
Well, I'm flattered that you mentioned those authors' names. They're not authors that I've particularly studied myself. So if I seem to be doing anything similar to them, it's to some extent a coincidence, I suspect. I don't quite understand your question in that you see my work located in the English countryside. I mean, are you suggesting if you are, it's fine, but are you suggesting that there's a part, my work is problematic in that sense, in that it's still kind of locked in a mythical past? But, okay, because what I'm attempting to do is to kind of take a step away from that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I thought you meant. Yes, I do. I mean, then the simple answer is yes. I think, and that, the writer who probably has influenced me most is Anderson, who you mentioned of those. So that's interesting that you make that connection. That's good. Yeah, that's interesting.
Just to come back to the answer you wanted for Quick Info. Quick Info started life, it's actually set up by two Americans, funnily enough, who were expats who wanted to know the cricket scores. And they started at the early days of the web. You know, it was one of the very first websites, very first major sporting website, should I say. Then it became an Indian enterprise. And then about 2 years ago, it was bought by ESPN, the American broadcaster. So it is an American company, but it is run really primarily for an Indian audience. But what you see every day, if you're in England, you'll log on to the English front page. If you're in India, you would get a different front page to the one you say. And that's a recent thing. Depending on where you live, you get a different front page to the website. You'll get the same articles in the end, but you have a different emphasis on certain subjects, certain, match reports, for example. You can have a lot of county reports on the English one. But if you go to the Indian one, you probably wouldn't see all those county reports. So at heart, it is still an Indian website. The editor, Sambit Bal, is Indian. All the sub-editors, or the deputy editors, etc., they're all Indian.
Kerry Dingle from WORLDwrite and the Citizen TV channel WORLDbytes. This is for Neil initially, and this is sort of broadening it out, sorry to be a bit less crickety, such is my preoccupations. Firstly, obviously you're a bit of an authority on Grace. I wonder whether Grace himself commented on the Oscar Wilde phenomena, given at the time, and if anyone else knows about CLR in relation to Oscar Wilde, that'd be interesting. And obviously what you're saying, Neil, in terms of how the Victorian elite used ideas of national identity and masculinity and explicitly anti-gay and in opposition, especially with the Wilde thing going on, which we know is the case. But I'm not clear on your conclusions in that you were talking about CLR's work being sort of unmediated somehow, or his model being wrong, or and we know that CLR very clearly challenges existing representation. Anthony's made the point in relation to Sobers, for example, in challenging ideas of national identity and what he bigs up. So to be blunt, are you saying that either CLR just misses the boat on this, or he's anti-gay in some way? No. So which I doubt, but I'm asking the question because, or is this, I'm not in love with the absence view of history, but it's interesting because we need to learn from weaknesses in history in terms of how things are challenged and dealt with. So, to be blunt, that's my question. For Anthony, your points about his subversion of the canon, I thought were, important ones, and I agree with your points on it. I want to ask you a kind of modern question, as the canon, the whole idea of a canon is now this huge sort of, are you with or against Gove, da-di-da-di-da, and education and beyond, whereas I'm very sympathetic to sort of CLR's idea of a canon of being, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, let's learn from great books and great literature. Would you go along with the idea of a modern cricket canon, and would CLR be in part of it? And what is your view on the canon, idea of a canon more broadly? And that might be for everyone.
Just
to stir it up a bit.
Shall I answer that first?
Tony, go ahead first.
Just quickly, because I don't think we have much time. So I'll just be quick on it. I just see canons as things that are constantly up for negotiation. And I think if we talk about cricket canons now, I mean, the idea of any centre now, because cricket is such a disparate now global thing, the centre of cricket is now South Asia, and that's going to affect the way it's written about, and the way that we classify what's written about, and the way how we attribute what we attribute to it. So basically, in a nutshell, I see canons of any sort as always constantly up for grabs.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think particularly of music, I talk to my kids about the accepted great albums. Nonsense. There's so much rubbish, excuse my mind, talked about. I think taste shift, boundary shift, and I think, you know, Cardus, for example, there's someone I grew up loving. Would he be part of the canon now? I'm not so sure, to be absolutely honest with you, because of I think the limitations of what he was writing about. I think, you know, someone like a Shieldberry, for example, purely through his work for the Sunday Telegraph and the Observer down the years, has got his finger on the pulse of cricket's changes all over the world, far more than someone like Cardus could ever have done, far more than John Arlott could ever have done. Now, there's no specific book that I would say sums up Shieldberry's contribution. It's purely journalism. Does that mean he's not part of the canon? You know, how do we decide what a canon is?
True.
Did you want to add anything?
Well, try and answer the question. So it was if I wasn't clear enough, clearly, to answer things. Clearly, James thinks that representation and representative figures is hugely important also for the organisation of political communities and things like that. So I'm thinking about how do you conceptualise these ones and how do you think about W.G. Grace as one that he started with from a child sort of age. I say his understanding of W.G. Grace was mediated by different kinds of magazines, and we should take into account mediation when thinking even about Sobers and other cricketers today, because other groups will, through their publications, try to tell you in some direction or other. We're not always in a direct relationship to watching the actual game that's being passed on. And so I'm then particularly interested in questions like, what about that particular magazine? In some ways I didn't do it adequately, but in a way you might say there's a range of representations of W.G. Grace. There are even representations which are anti-hagiographical in that period. In fact, the EBV Christian that you mentioned, in 1896, he wrote it in 1895, he put out a book called How's That? And there's a short article in there on stoutness. And of course, W.G. Grace is referred to as stout because the picture I gave you makes him look quite slim. He was about 18.5 stone in 1895. He's fat. And they try to get round this and actually say that the stout person is an object of ridicule, but we're making exception for his case. And there are a whole series of kind of counter representations, but they're on the fringes because, in a sense, certain dominant forces, not just elites, but different newspapers, different magazines, different forms of organisations, gathering together him as a central figure against Oscar Wilde in this particular case. So what I'm sort of saying is we need to look at the mediations between and exactly what role and how do representative figures work anyway. And it seems to be there are intermediary practices going on there. It's not always a direct relationship, as if people are seeing Garfield Sobers bat or Wilton St Hill. They're also reading about him and they're being influenced by a whole bunch of other intermediaries. And I'm just saying let's fess up to the intermediary roles that other people play in how we conceptualise these. I hope that answers it.
Thank you. Thanks, Neil. And that seems like a really good point to end and go and get some coffee or tea and scones and continue this discussion. So let's thank the panel again.